So now if we take a little bit of time to have a look at the mechanism of pain and how that relates to the analgesia that we can get from needling. So this is a simplified pain model, and it's a simplified analgesic model as well. I appreciate there are a lot more complex effects that can be occurring throughout this system, but as we're not here to talk primarily about neurophysiology, we're here to talk about how the needling can affect pain and how it can affect other sorts of issues. We're keeping that relative to where we're working and our level of understanding for clinical application. So you may find that you have other ideas about this system, and you may want to enhance this and add in other ideas as well, and that's completely fine. They appreciate it for what it is at this level. So if we look at a very simplified idea, we've got an initial pain, and let's place this perhaps in the knee. So we've got some knee pain, and we've got a response from the local C fibres, which are a large diameter unmyelinated afferents, picking up the response of this signal and transmitting it to the spinal cord. And it'll arrive within the spinal cord at a certain spinal segment, and if it's the knee, we could perhaps suggest that this was the sclerotomal innervation, a sclerotomal response, and it's arriving at the spinal cord around L3, give or take, or level. So when we talk about sclerotome, remember we've got dermatome and myotome and sclerotome. We've also got viscerotome as well. And viscerotome will be relevant a little bit later on. So we've got dermatome for skin, myotome for muscle, sclerotome for bone and connective tissue, and viscerotome for organs and organ responses. So if we've got this C fibre stimulus, the spinal cord, it's going to be terminating in the dorsal horn, where the majority of those C fibres do at that level. And if we're stimulating from the knee, maybe those sclerotomal fibres will be arriving at about L3. Well, there'll be synapses in the spinothalamic tract, and from there it will continue to ascend to the thalamus and progress on to the cortex. And when it arrives at the cortex, you're going to have a subjective response to that. You know, patients don't sit there and think, oh, that's 6 out of 10, that's 8 out of 10. They don't try and put it on an objective VAS type marker. They'll have some kind of psychosocial response to that. Oh, my knee's hurt and I can't do this, or I need to get some treatment, or I need to look at this or that, or it's going to stop me doing this. There'll be some kind of social perspective placed on that. And it's also worth considering that when we're talking about the pain arriving up here at the cortex, that as the old adage goes, the rain of pain falls mainly in the brain. So we're thinking about what goes on up here at these higher centres where we think about stuff. But it's not just about this straight pathway here, because we do get some branching off of this signal into the midbrain. And within that midbrain, we've got areas like the periaqueductal grey and the limbic system. And of course, we remember that the limbic system is involved with emotional responses. And as we've just said, the pain in this area has a very kind of social subjective construct to it. So it has a very emotional aspect, and that's interesting to remember, because that limbic system response not only occurs from the actual pain or dysfunction that individual feels, but there's also going to be an influence of acupuncture or needling response into that area. And there's also going to be a level of influence into that area, to that engagement between that individual and you. So the patient and their therapist, how they engage and how they become on board with that idea. And we'll see that in functional MRI scans, that the level of engagement or expectation between patient and clinician can influence outcomes to the positive, which is something worth considering, that getting your patient on board with what you're talking about. Now, let's not go off here and start thinking about, well, what you've got to do is to talk your patient into needling working. It's not really about that, because we can see a lot of the work discovered in the physiological mechanisms in acupuncture is done on anaesthetised rats and rabbits. So it's not really about talking about those effects and getting someone on board with that, but it's getting someone to engage with you positively about their total treatment and outcome, and that process and that journey that they're going on with you to some degree with their treatment. And so if you've got that engagement, and those of you who work in professional sport will know this more than anyone, there are certain athletes that connect to you. You'll have other colleagues there, but you may have a group of athletes that just connect with you. And you may also find you have athletes who don't connect with you. And again, one of those ideas that if someone doesn't engage with treatment, then a very old concept that actually appears in the Wan Dai Neijing, which is the Yellow Emperor's Classic in Internal Medicine, which is a textbook from 2,000 years ago, and it talks about if the patient doesn't engage, then treatment shouldn't continue. Now, I think we can qualify that a little bit more, and it may be the case for us that it's not that it doesn't continue, but we may need to change our approach. If we've got a one-size-fits-all approach to everybody, then it probably isn't going to fit all, so we may need to adapt to that. Another interesting quote that I like is one from Rudyard Kipling's If, where he states that if you can walk with kings but keep the common touch, what he means by that is the ability to change your language and your interaction depending on who you're dealing with. So when I've worked in sport, the language that I've used when I've dealt with, say, a footballer, a young player, I have to use a certain type of language to explain what's going on with him and how we're going to solve that problem. And then I may also have to engage with his parents and family, because they might be quite a young player, 16, 17, something like that, so they'll have some parental influence, and I might have to explain to them as well, engage with them. I may also have to explain to the club manager or chairman about what's happening to that player, and that's a different language. And I may also have to discuss that with the orthopaedic specialist who's seen that patient, so I have to again discuss that in a different way. I may also have to discuss that with other physical therapy or strength and conditioning colleagues, and again I may have to discuss that in a different way. So it's about that engagement, which I'm sure we're all aware of, but we need to adapt that to the patient as well, to engage the most of the limbic system we can when we're treating as well. So far this is our pain response. We've got this subjective feeling, and remember when we talk about subjective and objective, another interesting thing to consider philosophically, that everything is subjective. It doesn't matter how objective you are and what objective structure you put in to analyse anything, if it passes through you, which it has to at some point, it's subjective, because everything is subjective. It's always your interpretation of events that occurs. Again, another interesting quote is one from Francis Bacon from the 1600s, Age of Reason, where he talks about the idea that the best evidence is the evidence of one's own experience, because it's only the one that you can really rely on, because everything has a level of filter or agenda placed on it. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying that's what it is. And so when we're considering our level of evidence, we can only really be sure of the things that we are aware of ourselves. Now, of course, we need to take into account levels of evidence we can find elsewhere, so published evidence and patient experience and so on, and bring that together. And when we're thinking about evidence-based practice, it's perhaps worth understanding that evidence-based practice has three pillars. Best available external evidence, which is that published evidence that we talked about. Clinician experience, which is that interaction and that massive work that you build up over the years. And patient preference, again, about engaging limbic system and that individual story. So it's about bringing those elements together always. And one element isn't necessarily more important than the other, but it's thinking about how that interacts with this as well, which is very important, because it always does interact. So now we bring in a needling intervention and see what happens here. So we insert a needle into the tissue. The first thing we're going to get is trauma. What does trauma bring? It brings inflammation, heat, redness, pain, swelling, altered function. With those responses, we're going to have this increased circulation in this area, and that's going to bring about nitric oxide, adenosine, calcitonin-related peptide, and so on. So we're going to get vasodilation. The distortion of the needle, as we insert the needle and rotate it, that mechanical transduction, which is going to occur in that muscle and the connective tissue, is going to deform that tissue, and we'll get the firing off of mechanoreceptors local to the needle. And those will include A delta fibres, which are a small diameter myelinated afferent, and their response will be relevant to what happens next. But if we stay with this local tissue for a moment, this local inflammatory response, this increase in circulation and so on, and this release of adenosine will bind to the local C fibres. So if we're needling somewhere near the problem, we could perhaps have a physiological response from this local inflammatory action to these fibres. And if adenosine is binding to the C fibres and inhibiting C fibre transmission, we're getting that first stage of interfering with that signal. We can also get the release of local opioids here. Now this might take a couple of days to come on, but this local damaged inflammatory cells trigger this response. We can also get a heightened response of opioid reaction in the dorsal root ganglion. So it starts to respond to the production of opioids and becomes sensitised to that. Repeated needling in this area will bring about angiogenesis as well, because of the repeated stimulus of calcitonin gene-related peptide, CGRP, and so we'll get this increased angiogenesis, which can help with healing as well. But if we now look at this stimulus continuing from here, so that's our local chemical response. We've got an inflammatory response, we've got an opioid response there, and we've got a local A delta response. So those A delta fibres are a small diameter myelinated afferents, we mentioned, got a very rapid conduction rate when compared with the C fibres, and they will send the stimulus up. If we're needling in the same area, we're sharing the same segment, whether that be dermatome or myotome or perhaps sclerotome. That signal, as it ascends, will reach the spinal cord at the same segment if we're in the same area, and it will synapse in the dorsal horn as before. It's ascending through the anterior lateral tract as the A delta fibres terminate towards the arcuonucleus in the higher centres. But as it synapses in the spinal cord, we'll get this, this stimulus to the local intermediate cells there. Now those might link the layers above and below. So if we're talking about L3, remember we're also talking about L2 and L4, because they're not definitive layers. There's an interrelationship of tissue and neural structures between those communicating above and below. So we'll get this synapse in here of these intermediate cells, and as a result we'll get excitation of these fibres. Now excitation of these fibres from this stimulus in this region causes release of metenkephalin. And metenkephalin's function within this process causes the inhibition of transmission. So we get presynaptic inhibition at this point here, closing down of this terminal, so to speak. So the prevent of the transmission of signal. Now this mechanism you'll all be familiar with, more commonly known as gate control theory or pain gate theory or Melzack and Wall's pain gate theory. First sort of proposed and popularised by Melzack and Wall in the early part of the 60s. But it had been proposed by other groups around that time and before them as well. And what's interesting is Melzack and Wall talk very much about the higher centre response as well. What they're actually famous for is more of the segmental reaction, but they also had other layers in their ideas as well. So they weren't limited to this segmental idea. They had much higher thoughts about what was going on in the supraspinal regions as well. Now they were proposed for the Nobel Prize in the mid-60s, which they didn't get, and then re-proposed a few years later. But it doesn't take away the value of that work, the fact that they were not awarded those prizes, because this has been the basis for how we've explained a lot of mechanical pain reduction for decades since then, and it still serves as a working model really for how we explain needle mechanisms. So we've got this response here, we've got this release of metenkephalin, but we also have this continuation of ascending signal from the A delta fibres, reaching up to the pituitary hypothalamic complex and also the midbrain. And when we engage with these areas, we get a response to the release of endogenous opioids again, and in this instance, it's rather than metenkephalin, it's beta-endorphin. And the beta-endorphin's response in the periaqueductal Gray and the limbic region is to cause the release of monoamines driven by a response through the dorsolateral tract. So we have this descending release or descending response through the dorsolateral tract as it moves through the spinal cord, and then a release of two monoamines, namely serotonin and noradrenaline. Now when serotonin is released, it excites the intermediate fibres, and this excitation causes the release of metenkephalin again, and this again reinforces presynaptic inhibition. When we have this descending monoamine here, this one is noradrenaline, and noradrenaline's response is to close down the postsynaptic terminal, and so what we get is a prevention of the jump off here by metenkephalin, and then a prevention of the landing by noradrenaline. So we get metenkephalin, noradrenaline working together to inhibit this response. Now, the excitation of metenkephalin occurs at that segmental level and the reinforcement of that sort of process. But the descending inhibitory postsynaptic response occurs throughout the spinal cord. so it doesn't differentiate a spinal segment. So it's not necessarily reliant from its driver, but not from its analgesic mechanism on the ascending afferent input. And so it can occur throughout the spinal cord. Now, whilst we're on the subject here, coming back here to the ascending afferent input, and we talk about Melzack and Wall for a moment, they talked about A beta fibres, which are a larger diameter myelinating afferent, which some of you may be more familiar with when it comes to controlling pain with interventions like TENS and other electrical stimuli, or even physical therapies. And so we have this A beta response, and A beta is a little bit different when it gets to the spinal cord because it causes the release of GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, which can also inhibit C fibre transmission. So we could in fact have A delta and B fibres both in play at the same time, and there are actually numerous mechanisms by which this can occur, but we're just focusing primarily on this A delta response, because we could spend days just talking about these mechanisms. But I think as long as we've got a functional, usable explanation that we can clinically reason and work with our colleagues on and patients, we can come up with some explanation for why we're doing what we're doing. So we've got this ascending and then descending response, but it doesn't finish there, because we also have the release of beta endorphin into circulation and the release of ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this can influence levels of cortisol within the body, so modulate that response within the body. And as a result of that, can affect systemic inflammatory reaction, which again can be useful for healing, recovery, but also useful for stress responses, whether they be psychological or physiologically driven. They always end up being physiological. And we'll talk about that when we get onto stress, that there's no difference physiologically between psychological stress and physiological stress. They both drive a physiological stress response, and that can affect healing and recovery. And anything that cuts into your finite capacity to heal and recover will affect your performance. It's a simple cause and effect mechanism. So let's recap what we've got. We've got three main mechanisms here. We've got a local response, which is this local inflammatory and physiological reaction, and interrelationship between where the needle is and what's happening here and how this is relating to the pain and the pathology. We've got a segmental response, which is the gating effect. And what's interesting to remember here is this gating effect is fairly rapid, but it has a fairly quick decay as well, so we don't expect this to last too long. We've also got this supraspinal, so above the spinal cord, we can call that supraspinal. We've also got this supraspinal response, which involves this descending opioid mechanism that enhance and reinforce this response. Now, some studies show that to optimise this descending mechanism, the needles have to be in situ for around 20 minutes. Again, this is just an average, just a mean. So for some people the response will be immediate, for others much longer. But if we're looking at the average individual, if there's such a thing, then we're looking at around 20 minutes for this. There is some suggestion as well that if you want to enhance this response, then needling peripherally can be useful. So if we think about perineural strategies, if we're going down towards the hands, the feet, the connective tissue in those areas, we can get a stronger sympathetic response, which can give us more carryover to this stimulus. So we've got local, segmental and supraspinal. We can also enhance the outcome by repeating treatments. So treatments want to be about 20 minutes to get this effect. They also want to be repeated once every 3 days or so on to optimise this opioid response. And remember, that's that gene expression, so the increased sensitivity to opioids, but also an increased production of opioids as well. So everyone has a certain level of gene expression that's set for opioid production, but that can be altered. It can be enhanced and improved by something like needling strategies, but it can also be inhibited by use of opioids. So again, things that we know from addiction. I have a background working in mental health with addiction, and one of the things that we'll see in addiction is the constant use of opioid-based drugs will inhibit opioid production. And needling and interventions such as microsystem needling, like auricular needling, will be used to counter opioid addiction for two reasons. One, they're very parasympathetic in its intervention, and 2, it has a descending opioid effect. And what we find with opioid addiction is 1, you've got anxiety to your addiction, and 2, you have a reduced endogenous opioid production. And so that can be a negative, which can be improved or enhanced by repeated needling because of this modified gene expression that we can get. So it's worth considering that. So when you're looking at utilising a needle intervention, think about local, segmental, supraspinal effects. Now this can give you some indication as to where you put the needle and what you do with it, how long you leave it in, how much stimulus that you give as well. And so this takes a standard prescription and starts to challenge the variables within that prescription. And I think that's very important to consider, because that varies between individuals, particularly if you want to create the optimum dose, which is the minimum required to get the desired result. It's also worth considering that we've got dermatomal, myotomal and sclerotomal, but we also have a viscerotomal response as well. And this can become relevant if we're treating things like bowel and